Captain Mason Drake thought he was being clever when he poured a can of soda over First Lieutenant Ember Sutton's head in front of 30 soldiers at Forward Operating Base Rawl. "You look like you could use a shower, sweetheart," he said, grinning like it was just another ordinary Tuesday, another young officer he could mock under the shield of his rank. What he didn't realize was that Ember Sutton wasn't just another name on a roster. It carried a weight he couldn't begin to understand. Within 72 hours, that name would come back to haunt him and quietly dismantle his career in a way he'd never see coming.
Ember was 29 when that so-called joke found its mark. Standing in the motor pool of the eastern Afghanistan base, her uniform drenched, her face calm, but her fists clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white. It was July 2014, 6 months into her first deployment as a logistics officer with the 5th Armored Division, and even at 0700 hours, the heat was punishing. 4 years since earning her commission through ROTC, Ember had already proven herself, coordinating convoys, managing resupplies, and making sure every infantry squad had what they needed when it mattered most. It wasn't glamorous work, but it saved lives, and she excelled at it. If you're watching this on Military Stories and understand what it takes to keep soldiers breathing out there, drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because there are far more of them than anyone admits, and too many stay buried. Ember came from Boulder, Colorado, raised in a line of soldiers stretching back 3 generations. Her father, Brigadier General Owen Sutton, taught her that respect isn't handed out, it's earned, and once earned, never surrendered. The general had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan before moving into a Pentagon role. He brought up Ember and her younger brother with his own creed: integrity above all, accountability without excuse, and the belief that rank without character is just noise. He never dictated their paths, but he made one thing clear: if they wore the uniform, they'd better honor it. Ember chose logistics after commissioning through ROTC at Texas A&M because she wanted to fix the problems that kept others alive. Ember Sutton was methodical, organized, and unstoppable when it came to making sure her soldiers got what they needed to stay alive. She completed both the Basic Officer Leader course and the Quartermaster Officer Basic course, and later earned her airborne wings at Fort Benning because she believed real leaders never asked their soldiers to do something they wouldn't do themselves. Her father had first put a rifle in her hands when she was 12, teaching her the same way his own father had taught him, on a quiet range outside Boulder: iron sights, steady breathing, and patience. He told her discipline wasn't about control. It was about knowing the difference between the moment to act and the moment to wait. Ember carried that philosophy into everything she did, and it shaped the kind of leader she became. She never needed to yell or threaten. She simply set the standard and expected everyone to rise to it.
To her, the uniform stood for something sacred, a code that couldn't be compromised. When people fell short of that code, it got under her skin. When they used authority as a weapon, it made her blood boil. So when Captain Mason Drake decided to dump a can of soda over her head in front of her own troops, it crossed a line she would never forgive or forget. It happened during what was supposed to be a routine motor pool inspection. Ember was overseeing maintenance checks on a convoy of MRAPs when Drake strolled in unannounced. He was the executive officer for Bravo Company in a nearby battalion and had earned a reputation for being arrogant, condescending, and dismissive, especially toward women officers. He strutted through the motor pool like he owned the place, throwing out smug comments about how slow the work was going and asking if she needed help managing her soldiers. At first, she ignored him. Experience had taught her that arguing with men like Drake was a waste of breath, but he wouldn't stop. He joked about how logistics officers spent more time behind desks than in the dirt, then smirked and asked if she'd ever even been outside the wire. Ember met his gaze and calmly told him she'd run more convoy missions in the past 6 months than most infantry officers did in a year, and if he had any real concerns about her operation, he was welcome to bring them up with her battalion commander. That was when Drake smirked, grabbed a can of Coke from a nearby cooler, shook it hard, and poured it over her head slowly, deliberately, while 30 soldiers from both units stood and watched. A few looked away, uneasy. 1 or 2 forced a nervous smile. Drake just laughed and said she looked like she could use a shower. He told her not to take it personally, it was just a joke, and she needed to lighten up. Ember Sutton didn't say a word. She stood there, soda dripping down her face and neck, her uniform stained a dull brown, her expression steady and unreadable. She didn't yell, didn't swear, didn't even flinch. Instead, she picked up the maintenance log from the hood of a Humvee, marked down a missed inspection entry, and calmly keyed her radio to redirect her maintenance crews. Then she turned around and walked straight back to her office without a single word.
What Captain Mason Drake didn't realize, what no one did besides Ember's immediate chain of command, was that her father wasn't just any general. Brigadier General Owen Sutton was scheduled to arrive at Forward Operating Base Rawl in 72 hours for an operational review of Regional Command East. Ember sat alone in her office for 20 minutes after the incident, staring at the wall and forcing herself to breathe evenly. The soda had dried sticky and cold against her skin, and she could still hear Drake's laugh echoing in her head. Her thoughts drifted to her father and the conversation they'd had before she deployed. His warning that some people would never respect her, that some would use her gender as a weapon to discredit her. His advice had been simple: don't get louder, don't get angrier, just be better. She thought of the soldiers in that motor pool who had seen it all, some of them her own, and how her reaction now would define how they viewed her for the rest of the deployment. If she ignored it, they'd lose respect. If she lashed out, she'd be labeled emotional or weak. The only choice was the professional one. Handle it by the book, through the chain of command, with documentation, and without giving Drake any ammunition to use against her. Yet a small part of her, the voice that sounded like her father's, wanted Drake to know exactly who she was. Wanted to see his face when he realized that the officer he'd humiliated was the daughter of the general about to evaluate his command. She didn't act on that impulse. Instead, she sat quietly, let the anger settle, and began drafting an incident report.
The next morning, Ember submitted it to her battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Holt. She described everything that had happened, listed witnesses, and made clear she wasn't seeking special treatment. She was reporting unprofessional behavior that could qualify as hazing under Army regulations. Holt read the report, met her eyes for a long moment, and assured her he'd take care of it. He forwarded it up the chain with a note emphasizing that the incident violated professional standards and warranted a command-directed investigation. What Holt didn't tell her was that Captain Mason Drake already had a reputation. Several informal complaints, both from men and women, had been logged about his conduct over the years. None had triggered formal action, but the pattern was there, quietly documented in his personnel notes. Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Holt made sure every note and prior complaint was attached to Ember Sutton's report before forwarding it. The problem was Captain Mason Drake's battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Trent Rowe, wasn't eager to take action. Rowe was a longtime friend of Drake's father, a retired colonel with plenty of influence still echoing through the Army. After reading the report, Rowe told Holt he'd handle it informally, just a private counseling session, and insisted no formal investigation was necessary. He added that young officers needed to toughen up in a combat environment. Holt was furious, but there wasn't much he could do without stepping outside his authority. He informed Ember of Rowe's decision and apologized, telling her sometimes the system failed, but at least her report was officially on record. Ember simply nodded, thanked him, and went back to work. She didn't argue, she didn't vent, she waited.
2 days later, Brigadier General Owen Sutton arrived at Forward Operating Base Rawl with a small advance team,
to conduct an operational review of logistics and supply procedures across Regional Command East. The base commander met him at the landing zone, and within an hour, word spread like wildfire. A one-star general was on the ground running inspections. Drake heard the news in the Tactical Operations Center and cracked a joke about how generals always showed up when things were going well. He had no clue who Sutton was or why he was there. The general spent his first day meeting with senior staff and reviewing reports. On the second day, he requested a tour of the logistics wing, specifically the motor pool, where all convoy maintenance took place. Lieutenant Colonel Holt personally guided him through the tour, and Ember was called in to brief the general on her platoon's mission and operational readiness. When she walked into the briefing room, she saw her father standing at the front, arms folded, his expression unreadable. She saluted sharply, introduced herself by rank and name, and began her briefing. There was no acknowledgement of their connection, just professionalism. General Sutton asked focused questions about maintenance cycles, supply chain timing, and convoy security. Ember answered each one clearly and confidently. When the briefing wrapped, he thanked her, dismissed her, and she saluted before stepping out.
20 minutes later, General Sutton called Lieutenant Colonel Holt into a private meeting. Without preamble, he asked about the incident report involving Captain Mason Drake. Holt was caught off guard. It hadn't come up during the tour. Sutton told him he had reviewed every report filed in the past month as part of his assessment, and what he read about Drake's behavior was unacceptable. He wanted to know why no formal action had been taken. Holt explained the situation with Lieutenant Colonel Rao and the so-called informal resolution. General Sutton listened silently, then reached for the phone, called the base commander, and stated plainly that he was ordering a command-directed investigation into the incident. He also instructed that Captain Drake be immediately relieved of his duties pending the inquiry. The base commander agreed without hesitation. That same afternoon, a meeting was arranged with Captain Mason Drake and Lieutenant Colonel Trent Rao. Brigadier General Owen Sutton didn't raise his voice or issue threats. He simply asked Drake to explain his version of what had happened in the motor pool. Drake, still unaware of who Sutton really was or why he was being questioned, tried to laugh it off. He said it had been a harmless joke, that Ember Sutton had overreacted, and that he'd already apologized. The general leaned forward slightly and told him in an even tone that First Lieutenant Ember Sutton was his daughter, and that if Drake had treated her with the respect her rank and service deserved, he wouldn't be sitting in that chair. He made it clear the matter wasn't personal, it was about professionalism. Drake had abused his authority, created a hostile work environment, and behaved in a manner unbecoming of an officer. The investigation would move forward and accountability would follow. The room fell silent. The color drained from Drake's face. Lieutenant Colonel Rao, who had brushed off the initial complaint, now found himself facing a general demanding answers. The base commander assured them that the inquiry would be conducted thoroughly and properly documented.
3 days later, Captain Mason Drake was officially relieved of duty. The command-directed investigation confirmed a clear pattern of unprofessional behavior, supported by witness statements and prior informal complaints in his record. He received a General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand permanently filed, and with it, any chance of promotion or command was gone. He was reassigned to a rear staff post for the rest of his deployment. Ember Sutton returned to her duties, running convoys, managing logistics, and keeping her unit operational. Her soldiers saw her differently now, not because of who her father was, but because of how she had handled the entire situation with quiet discipline and unwavering professionalism. General Owen Sutton finished his inspection tour without speaking to her privately about what had happened, but years later, he told her he had never been prouder of how she'd carried herself. Ember eventually left the Army as a captain and became a supply chain consultant for disaster relief efforts. The story spread quietly among those who had served at Forward Operating Base Rawl, a lingering reminder on military stories that rank without respect is meaningless, and that underestimating who deserves dignity in uniform can cost more than a career.